Hello, everybody, and welcome to Unlearning Economics. So, I have with me Dr. Ingrid Kvangraven, who is a senior lecturer at King's College London and an expert on all things global development, which is what we're going to talk about today. So, thanks so much for joining me, Ingrid.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to finally join this
I know,
channel.
yeah, we've been trying to do it for a while, and it hasn't happened. That's mostly my fault. I've been sort of pushing it back by a week for about 6 weeks, but we're finally here. So we hear a lot about global development, and we hear a lot of, I think, fairly optimistic news these days on social media from the World Bank, from mainstream economists. You hear, for example, about the decline in global poverty over the past few decades. There were, according to the World Bank statistics, there were maybe 90% of the globe were living in extreme poverty, defined as under $2.15 a day. Now it's more like 90% of the globe are out of extreme poverty, and only 10% are left in extreme poverty. You've got progress in things like infant mortality, vaccinations, you've got literacy, you've got all these gains, and plus you've got these big case studies, right, that people point to: China, South Korea, the East Asian tigers, perhaps even more so, as well as some slightly less emphasized success stories like Botswana or maybe Bangladesh. So I'd say your point of view on this, I wouldn't say it just completely naysays this narrative and says no, none of that's real, but it provides quite a lot of context on these recent trends in global development. So could you talk us through this?
Yes, thank you. And that's a great introduction, because you're right. Often it's, depending on where you get your news, I guess this is often kind of the narrative that you get, and you definitely get it from the World Bank. So I'm coming from the perspective of, I guess, if you see like from like the global South in general, or like, yeah. There is, of course, some progress has been made. Infant mortality rates, some poverty reduction, especially in China, and a lot of technological advancements. But there is still hierarchy in terms of development when we talk about development. So what do I mean by that? If you think about the category of the global South, for example, countries that were like lower income or middle income countries 100 years ago, only 5 countries actually graduated, let's say, as in the World Bank language, to become industrialized countries, right? So the rest of them, more than 100 countries are still, in this category of the global South, which means, huge inequality there. So you'll have a wealthy core also within these countries, but huge like unevenness. And a lot of that has to do with the way that capitalism developed globally, where, it started in England, in the global North, and then spread to the globe in a way that was very different from how it developed in England, right? So it kind of, came to Latin America, Africa, Asia, in a way that was very... It was also during colonialism, or even before colonialism, that this happened. So it happened in a very extractive way, shaped a lot of these economies in a way that was oriented towards just extracting resources for the empires of the time. And those structures still remain to a very large extent, where a lot of these countries have, a small sector that has formal employment that looks a bit more like what we think about like an employment here in the global North, like normal like wage relations, and then huge amounts of workers that are in informal labor, or that are unemployed, or that are working on export processing zones with awful conditions. So that's when you have that in mind, these statistics look a little bit different. And also, this isn't my work, but there's also been a lot of critique of this statistic of the World Bank poverty. The poverty statistic and how they measure extreme poverty. But yeah, you can go to the work of like Sanjay Reddy and Jason Hickel and stuff for that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about it, and I've kind of criticised that $2.15 a day line, and how it's constructed. But I think maybe we'll talk about that in a bit. For now, though, I'm quite interested because I think what your work offers is this context, right? So it's one thing to look at the statistics. And let's just accept them as true, right? For now. But what you're saying is you've got this kind of, not this process of poorer countries gradually becoming like richer countries, although there are a few case studies where that has kind of happened. What you're saying is you've got basically the norm is this very informal employment, not really capitalism, but still part of capitalism, right? Not this sort of formal employment with expanding, investing businesses, but more like people kind of scraping by. I can't remember who it was who coined the term wage hunter-gatherers, but it's sort of like, the pedicab that takes the tourists around a stall, actual begging and all this kind of this subsistence that is literally just that, right? So, I mean, could you talk us through why you don't see this system as it exists converging to a capitalist, or what we think of as capitalism, to the situation in a Western or richer country? Yeah. Another big question.
Yeah. Huge question. I like it. So I guess maybe to backtrack a bit, I'll get to that. But I mean, the question before.
Yeah.
We get to that question would be, why would we expect that to begin with, right?
Right.
There would be this transition to smooth, rational, all-encompassing capitalism with wage labor relations, which is this kind of expectation that I think underlies a lot of economic theory, which is one of the arguments that I make in the forthcoming book with Carolina Alves and Sherry Kezar.
We got the plug in early. We'll discuss the book, definitely.
Yeah. That can be maybe another episode.
Yeah.
So basically in the book, and I mean, this is also old scholarship from like Samir Amin from the 80s, who was an Egyptian French dependency theorist who wrote this book on Eurocentrism. And he said that one of his arguments was that, well, there's this idea that capitalism developed in Europe in a way that was self-contained. It was because of technological advancement. It was because of hard work. It was because of these technological improvements. So therefore, you had like just improvements in living standards and technology that led to capitalist development, and this could then be exported to the rest of the world. So we have this kind of in our background in the back of our heads in economics, and we think that why isn't this happening everywhere? This happened in England, so why doesn't it happen in Bangladesh, let's say? But then the issue, which Samir Amin identified very early on, is that that's not how capitalism developed in England. I mean, that's a part of the story, but really it was about, that kind of stylized narrative ignores things like colonialism and the resources that supported the development of capitalism in England, the slave trade, and also how incredibly exploitative the exploitation that came with capitalist development in England. It wasn't this peaceful, rational process that we often assume. So if you take that as a starting point, then it becomes almost like a lot more plausible or implausible that story would be replicated elsewhere, right? Because the extraction and that development of capitalism in the global north was built on was taking away resources from the global south. So this is, I know we're in theory talking about dependency theory, right? And some of the starting points of the dependency tradition is the development of underdevelopment, the link between the development in the global north and what's going on in the global south. So if you think about this, that there are, a lot of corporations that are making huge amounts of profits here in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, US, and the global north, based on labor in the global south, then it becomes a bit easier to see why that's not happening in a lot of countries in the global south, because they're the ones that are, basically having their labor exploited. Why can't they just create their own multinationals and exploit other countries in the global south or north? There's like a huge amount of constraints that prevent them from doing so. A lot of countries have had like national development strategies where they've tried. Like, for example, in the early 1900s, a lot of countries in Latin America were doing import substitution industrialization. They were thinking, okay, we're going to industrialize like the global north. We're just going to protect our economies for a little bit because our domestic firms are not competitive yet, but we'll, import technology and, help them develop. And that worked to some extent, but they were then importing technology from the global north to have it as inputs to, industrialize. And that was, they were using US dollars then, which is the world's currency, and a lot of them ended up in debt crisis. It wasn't sustainable. So therefore, there's these constraints make it very difficult to kind of replicate what the global north has done. The countries that did develop, like South Korea, for example, did this import substitution industrialization thing as well, but they had huge amounts of financial support from the Western countries that were, very, very interested in South Korea being an important military base for them to challenge North Korea. So that was like a very particular geopolitical and historical moment that led these constraints to be relaxed. But for most countries in the global south, it's almost impossible to replicate this kind of development process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's kind of a marker of a mainstream economist to create a theory and then call it a puzzle as to why the theory doesn't conform to reality, right? And you've got this notion of convergence that I think has been very prevalent throughout the mainstream literature. This idea that, with the right endowments and the right policies, and then later the right institutions, the goalposts are kind of shifting every so often, but that they will just converge. But then if you don't believe that theory, there's simply no reason to believe that would happen, right? And I suppose the way you put it is that England and other countries in Europe and then the USA, they kind of got a head start first, so became dominant, and they got that head start directly through exploitation. So you mentioned dependency theory, right? And this is kind of your thing, I think. Yeah. So I've been reading your papers on it. So I think just for everybody in the audience who isn't necessarily familiar with dependency theory, could you explain what this is and how this differs from the kind of convergence view?
Yeah. So it's not that easy a question because there's so many different dependency theories, but that was what, so I wrote my PhD about this. So I spent a lot of time reading dependency, and I was wondering, what is dependency theory? I was reading a lot of stuff. And of course found out that there isn't one theory. There are multiple theories, Marxist theories, Latin American theories, structuralist theories, which come from Latin America, and institutional theories as well. So there's a lot of debate actually within dependency theory. So in the end, then part of my PhD became about defining the common elements that are important in dependency theory. And then, so what I think that they are is they take a very historical approach to understanding capitalist development. So this is like a part of the development of underdevelopment that I mentioned earlier, where they see how capitalism evolved in this uneven way, and they try to understand capitalism in the periphery, which is what they call it global south, in connection with how it evolved in the global north. And they're seeing this as part of the same system. That's one thing. They focus on the specific constraints that this leads to for the periphery, like the kind of balance of payments constraint that I mentioned earlier, how they're impacted by having to borrow in the US dollar and technological and dependence and things like that. There's a range of constraints that come from being in the periphery that they try to identify. They see capitalism as inherently polarizing or uneven, like generating this unevenness, which is in stark contrast to a more mainstream understanding of seeing it as, one country developed and then others just catch up, and then you can all have all countries equally developed. That would be impossible in a dependency theory scenario. I think those are the main.
That's an exhaustive list. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah. And then, so those are kind of the key commonalities that I think are important in dependency theory. Maybe some might disagree, but I think the most important ones are covered by those commonalities. And I guess maybe the other thing to mention is that it evolved as a theory and a political project in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, in a large part as a response to the failure of this import industrialization, import substitution industrialization, ISI, that I mentioned earlier. Like, because a lot of the heterodox scholars or like structuralists in Latin America were seeing that it wasn't possible to just catch up with the global north by implementing free market policies and things like that. So they were trying to, come up with policies so that they could correct their imperfections, I guess, and industrialize. So, protect themselves from competition and things like that. But dependency theorists were seeing that wasn't really working. It was leading all these countries into crisis. So that's kind of where they came from. They were all very politically involved. People not like how academics are today. They were all a lot of them were revolutionary. The ones that weren't revolutionary were still like very interested in policy and working with the UN or working with governments.
Yeah, the definition I've got written down is a situation where the economy of certain countries is conditioned by the development and expansion of another. Right, so that's like so basically you can't develop unless we say so is the way I interpret it, right? So let me ask you a little bit more about this Latin American and South Korean contrast, right? Because I think for me, when I hear about this, being somebody who doesn't really know anything, not know much about this, I sort of think, oh, okay, well, you've got the Latin American industrial policies in the 50s and 60s, and they didn't really work. And then you've got the Korean and other Southeast Asian industrial policies right a bit later on, in the 70s and the 60s as well, in the 70s and 80s, and they did work. And sort of my kind of mealy-mouthed centrist takeaway is like, oh, industrial policy is really hard, right? It just sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work, and maybe it was just bad design in Latin America and a bit of luck or bad luck for them. But I think this is the picture you're painting is well, I mean, it's much richer than that, right? So could you maybe just in as much depth as you can sort of contrast them on what went right in the South Korean case for them at least, and what went wrong in the Latin American case?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's also it was the question that you're asking was a huge debate in the 80s and 90s, and then it kind of dipped down, but now it's even like emerging even within mainstream economics. So which is interesting. Like, how do you get the right kind of industrial policy, and what does that mean anyway? So according to like the mainstream literature, South Korean just kind of followed a market-based approach more or less. But according to there's like a huge heterodox literature on the developmental state, which looks at specific features of Korea and they point to a variety of issues. Like, this is like Robert Wade and Alice Amston and Hadron Chang as well, point to things like the relationship between the state and the private sector, that they had a very close relationship, but not too close, that there was corruption. That's actually Peter Evans's argument. There was like they were able to discipline the private sector, but also work with them. So they would give, like, for example, say a 5-year subsidy for an electronics firm to develop their to like get ahead and like develop their industry, but they would not extend that. They would there would be an incentive for this corporation to not just take the subsidy and sit with it and get a higher profit, but actually develop so that they would become competitive. So there's this huge literature on this, which I think is quite important. I think that literature is also a bit. It's a bit limited because they don't emphasize the geopolitics as much as I would, like the fact that they had the support from the US. And when you kind of sweep that under the carpet or ignore it, then it becomes easy to say, but you can just replicate South Korea in Ethiopia or Rwanda or wherever. even though that condition isn't there, which a lot of these developmental state scholars are now, the newer ones are now doing. But I think that is like crucial, the geopolitical environment. And then there's another layer that I think is important, which is kind of the structure of the economy of the East Asian countries in general compared to those of Latin America or Africa or other Asian countries. If you look at like the history, so in South Korea, for example, was colonized by Japan. It was a very different kind of colonization than what Ghana, for example, experienced under Britain. It was one where there was still like an emerging business class within South Korea that developed during the colonial period, so that when the kind of developmentalist period began, the conditions were very different. So it actually was easier for them to become industrialized very quickly. Whereas in Ghana, for example, it's the form of colonialism was completely extractive, and it basically tried to squash any kind of entrepreneurship or business, indigenous business class in the country, because they were worried that would compete with the English. So the English colonizers gave a lot of support to the firms from their country, and so that they could extract gold and cocoa and all these things, all these commodities. So when Ghana then became independent in 1957, there was a completely different structure. So they tried ISI as well, but almost immediately ran into this foreign exchange constraint, and it was very, very, very difficult. So I think, I don't know if that was in enough depth.
So no. It was a lot. That was a lot of depth. Thank you.
Okay.
I guess with a few of those examples, what I'm thinking is, and I guess this is the $1 million question in a way, but what are is it just the case that some relationships with poorer countries, between richer countries and poorer countries, have developed as extractive ones? And this is a bit of an Acemoglu-Robinson point, and you mentioned extractive, and some have not developed that way. And is it possible, to somehow change the relationships? And I'm not saying that's like a light switch that can be flicked off or on, but is it possible to sort of change the relationships between the countries, and that would allow poorer countries to develop? Or is it the conceit, or not the conceit, but the charge of dependency theory that's kind of impossible, that at least on any mass scale, maybe again, South Korea, maybe one or two here and there, but really, as long as you retain global capitalism, that global capitalism needs those extractive relationships. And if you're talking about getting rid of them, you're talking about getting rid of capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's the latter part might be. No, it depends a little bit on who you're asking, but I think maybe one thing is that I think it's not necessarily that if you change the kind of bilateral relationship between a country in the global south and a country in the global north, that would solve the issue. I think the relationship between the global south and global north, or say for example, Ghana and UK, just to kind of have one example, or you could have Brazil and US, or the fact that there are these relationships that are problematic in terms of like the IMF and the World Bank putting conditions that make it hard for these countries to borrow enough to invest, or to spend enough on the public sector, or infrastructure, or industrial policy. If that wasn't there, if the IMF was abolished, the World Bank was abolished, and the UK just stayed far away from Ghana, didn't intervene at all, or even if they gave some support, that wouldn't necessarily lead to development in Ghana. It's like all those kind of imperialist forces make the situation much, much worse, but it's still a question of capitalist uneven development. So it's still firms in the world, in the global economy, that big firms that are trying to exploit labor where they can across the globe, and that it's very difficult for some firm to come up in a country with very weak institutions and low technological capacity to try to compete with a global firm in any kind of meaningful way, even without the IMF and the World Bank and sort of UK bilateral policy. So in a way, I think so that was kind of like I guess a caveat, like even changing like a relationship with an institution or a country wouldn't, I think, solve the underlying problem, which is this, the development of underdevelopment, unevenness within capitalism. Of course, you can have capitalist development, and you do have capitalist development, across the global south. But it'll always be uneven. So even if I feel like sometimes we conflate the discussion about like industrialization and capitalist development maybe with this discussion, because like South Korea obviously is industrialized, and I think that's what a lot of countries are trying to achieve, whereas Ghana, for example, is not industrialized, partially industrialized, but not nowhere near as much as South Korea, but it has development. I mean, it has capitalist development. So if the question is industrialization, then it would be about industries, firms arising to compete with the global market, which is very difficult.
Even if you sort of make the World Bank and WTO and IMF fair, or abolish them, as you said, you still think you still think you're going to get that necessarily get that exploitative relationship.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm all for abolishing those institutions. they make the situation worse, but they're reflecting a power balance that already exists. So I think sometimes I feel like that's a bit like almost like focusing too much on those institutions. That the key issue is almost I don't want to say it like I think that's a radical and useful thing, but it's almost like a little bit like the Eurocentric view of capitalism, because it's thinking, Ghana can develop just like the UK, if only IMF and the World Bank and the WTO didn't do these terrible things. But that's kind of then forgetting the fact that actually capitalism developed in a particular way, and that's not going to go away just if these institutions are abolished.
I mean, I wonder what your opinion of Caldor's growth laws is, because I wanted to ask you about this. So just for everybody watching/listening, Caldor's growth laws basically state that the growth of an overall economy is dependent on manufacturing, partly because manufacturing itself has very fast productivity growth compared to other sectors, and partly because manufacturing seems to have positive knock-on effects on the rest of the economy. So it can seem like a little bit archaic, this idea that you've got to make stuff that you drop on your foot, but especially in the age of the information economy. But at the same time, the major success stories do seem to center around manufacturing, and India, for example, has always kind of struggled, and people said it skipped the manufacturing stage, but it seems like it didn't really get on the same train as China. So, I mean, what do you think of those? And also, even if they're true, I suppose, in a narrow sense, what I hear you saying is that it's just not possible for everybody to do that. So that means we probably need to rethink what we mean by development, right?
Yeah. Great question. So, I mean, I do think that, and a lot of these, the structuralists also, Prebisch, I think, made a similar point. And even people like Hadron Chen and like Eric Reinhardt, like the developmentalist people of today, talk a lot about the need for manufacturing, and especially particular kinds of manufacturing, I guess, that have like increasing returns to scale. Just manufacturing, I think, is probably not enough, because there has been a huge shift towards manufacturing-based production in the global south, with the breakup of the global production basically in the 70s, where corporations in the global north were facing a profit squeeze, huge inflation, and basically chopped in their production line into global value chains and outsourced production to the global south. So now you have production all over the world, people making sneakers in Cambodia for Nike and iPhones in China for Apple. So there has been a spread of manufacturing. It's just that it's been in the very low value added parts of the value chain where the profits are still located in the global north to a very large extent. So that's one issue. I do think that, I mean, there's been a lot of growth in resource-rich countries across the global south, and a lot of the time that has to do with like when primary commodity prices are high, they grow a lot. When primary commodity prices are low, they struggle. So in a sense, like moving to manufacturing can shield a little bit from this like huge volatile price swings of commodity dependence. But manufacturing itself doesn't lead to this kind of good jobs or becoming a high income country or anything like that, because the way that manufacturing has spread across the globe has been through these global value chains. So then the challenge, I mean, from the developmentalist scholars would say, well, okay, you need to then find a way to move up the global value chain. And that's, I feel like in a lot of development economics and development studies, that's like the puzzle for how it's posed for countries. How can you move up it, like into higher value added? But there's because of the power structures of these global value chains is like very, very difficult, because the corporations that are governing the global value chains don't want to share technology. They like really, really secure their intellectual property rights so that it's not easy for someone who's manufacturing Nike shoes to actually start to compete with Nike. That would be a huge jump. So I think that's also part of the issue, that in a lot of this like global value chain, GVC literature, it's kind of assumed that you can kind of climb up the global value chain ladder without recognizing the power dynamics there. Sorry, I'm being very negative.
No. I'm asking. I'm pushing. I'm kind of pushing you to be negative. I'm asking you questions that make you seem like you're being negative. But yeah, no. I mean, I suppose there's a musical chairs problem, isn't there, as well, right? To kind of maybe that sounds a bit glib, but there's a bit of a musical chairs problem, right? If you've got a hierarchical global value chain, then someone's always going to be at the bottom, right? And I mean, does that tend to go? Is there a reason that tends to happen along national lines, right? So rather than say a sort of global proletariat, if you like, right? Do you think that the subordination of specific countries is like necessarily a part of this, or is it something where you could see a sort of horrible global capitalist system with like an international proletariat?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So it's something I'm working on a paper or a book maybe on this, but not exactly on this, but kind of related to it, because I think some of dependency theory, a lot of dependency theory was, criticizing methodological individualism in the mainstream, which is like focusing on the individual, and criticizing methodological nationalism, which is focusing on the nation. But some of them actually did end up kind of fetishizing the nation state, and saying, it's the countries that are subordinate in the global system. Where, I mean, I think the better ones, the stronger ones, were like, no, it's not that countries are subordinate, it's that the way that capitalism evolved and the working class in the global south and the capitalist class too, I guess, face certain constraints from being part of the global system. So there is like subordination, I guess, a hierarchy along national lines, but it isn't that the nation is subordinate itself, if that makes sense. So if you think about like a lot of the work of Marini, Brazilian dependency theorist, was looking specifically at how being a part of the economy of the global south led to like what he called it super exploitation, which is like you're exploited because you're a worker, but you're also more exploited because you're the firm that you're employed by is in the global south and has to compete with countries in the global north, and therefore needs to suppress or exploit workers more. So I think probably that might be a better way of thinking about it. Also because if you think about it in terms of nations, then you're kind of assuming that a country like England is like, perfectly wealthy, whereas there's obviously a huge amounts of problems and poverty and people, working without having enough money to eat a nutritious diet. So I think kind of breaking up, I mean, of course, the nation is important. There's a hierarchy that's important. There's the way capitalism developed, which was partially through nation states, which is important. But I think there is unevenness within countries and global North countries and global South countries that also needs to be taken into account.
You've got, the two layers, or at least two layers, right? So you've got, like, I suppose dependency theorists, because it's quite adjacent to Marxism, there's a lot of crossover, right, would tend to think of all workers as exploited, but also if you're a worker in a global South country, then you've got, your relationship to these international institutions, the terms of trade, your place in the global value chain, all of these factors that contribute to the fact that you're essentially paid even less than the workers in the richer countries. They at least get the kind of benefit of having a seat at the table, right, and having stronger currencies and all the rest of it. Yeah.
That's a good summary.
Yeah. Cool. Good. I'm glad. So no, you hinted at this, right? Because I wanted to ask you. So it's interesting because what this points to is not just this international hierarchy, but a sort of tendency of capitalism, right? And there's this term Brazilianization, which you might have heard, right? And Brazil is very famous for, I mean, it had a decline in its manufacturing sector in relative terms and became more dependent on commodities in the latter half of the 20th century. It's got very high inequality, and it's got this situation where, again, there are a lot of people kind of scraping by day to day alongside a wealthy elite, and a lot of servants and maids and the kind of middle class won't vote for a progressive government because they'll lose their housemaid, that kind of situation, right? And this term Brazilianization refers to the idea that this could become the norm across the world, right? In the UK, I mean, I think we're seeing it in the UK. I think we're already seeing it in the UK, right? Perhaps more so than any other Western country. But do you see that as a tendency, if it's not arrested, this Brazilianization of everywhere, and maybe even the United States itself? Well, maybe it already applies there.
Yeah, great question. I think, I mean, to some extent, yes. I think that's true. I think, for sure. With neoliberalism, there's been huge amounts of the huge rise in precarious employment, which was not the norm in the global North. It has been the norm in the global South. So in a sense, you could say that there's global South coming to the global North. I think sometimes, just to kind of maybe put maybe a couple of caveats on it, is that it's not like the golden age of the post-war era, that there was it was all formal wage labor that was great. There was always precariousness that I think we've ignored to a large extent, and in the US as well. So it's that part, it's the precarious part of the labor relations that has expanded in the global North. So in that sense, I feel like maybe it's a little bit misleading to say that, it's, the stuff from the global South is coming to the global North. It's, it's the shift towards more precarious employment that was there to a certain extent, but now, it's getting bigger. But yeah, that is, leading to a situation where there's a larger extent of precarious work, which is, more similar to the kind of structure that you see in the global South. So that's I think important. And that does kind of lead us to think differently, I guess, about how labor is organized in the world economy. I would still say that it's I like the conversation that we had about, it's not just about nation, it's about labor relations, capitalism, how it developed. I still think though that there is sort of a case for thinking about how global South is different from the global North, even though the global North is now showing a lot of symptoms that the global south has been showing for a long time, with also rising poverty and inequality as well as precarious work.
Yeah.
Because of these other structures that we talked about, right? Like the international institutions, the currency, and all like other structures that make it that constrain people, classes, governments in the global south. But yeah, I wouldn't call it Brazilianization, but yeah, there is a kind of structural shift in labor happening in the global north. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the term precariat because it was popular. I think it was Guy Standing who coined it in like maybe 2011. I can't remember, but I know that a lot of people who work, in on the global south and in the global south have criticized that for not being a new thing, including your co-author Serbi, right? She's criticized that. So it's just important to, I think, bear that in mind at the very least, that this idea of precarious employment, although it seems to have come to us, through the Deliveroo driver in the UK or whatever, it really isn't new. I want to talk, so going back to the sort of international perspective, and you have touched on quite a few of these, but I want to talk a little bit about mechanisms, right? And you've focused quite a lot on financialization. So I think it'd be nice to kind of communicate to people how this works, because there's this hierarchy of currencies, and this really is an international, this really is a nation state thing, I think, isn't it? You've got the dollar is clearly the dominant currency in the world. It's the world's reserve currency. Then you've got the pound, the euro, the yen, maybe more and more the renminbi, and then you've got sort of countries like Latin America, which it's not a country, I'm sorry, but like which you've mentioned a few times, right? But the Latin American relationship with the dollar is one where they are completely dependent on it. In West Africa, you've got the CFA franc, which a lot of people I don't think even realize exists. That's actually an even more explicit dependent relationship on France. So could you maybe talk us through this and how this affects countries in the global south, and these that are at the bottom or close to the bottom of the hierarchy of currencies?
Yeah, great question. So thinking about where to start. There's a currency hierarchy. The post-Keynesians have identified this very clearly, empirically, demonstrating how currency are structured in a hierarchy, and for some countries it's much easier to obtain, like to borrow, for example, in their own currency on the global market. The US can borrow in its own currency as much as it wants, whenever, from whoever. This is always possible. It's at the top of the hierarchy, whereas everyone else basically either borrow in dollars or in some of the other big currencies, or try to borrow in their own currencies. But like, for example, Ghana again, which is a country that I've been working on lately. So sorry for using that example all the time, but in their, like, if they want to borrow in Cedi, their local currency, the interest rates are like 20%. So it's much more expensive for them to borrow in their own currency. They might still want to, and they are trying to develop their local currency markets so that so they're not so dependent on the dollar, right? So it's like an alternative to the dollar, but it's extremely expensive. So that's kind of the huge problem. And for these countries, they tend to need money to invest in things that they don't have, like infrastructure, or industrial projects, social security, so basically there is a need to borrow, but it's very expensive. So that's it. That basically makes the problem harder, the development problem harder. So that's another very concrete way that this international hierarchy impacts these countries. I think so. That literature, I think, is really important. We wrote a paper last year, International Financial Subordination, we called it,
yes,
which is with like seven. Oh wow, nice. We're 7 authors. Post-Keynesians, Marxists, dependency theorists. It was like a huge, very interesting, many-year-long project.
Yeah, you'd think 7 authors would split the workload by 7, but actually, if anything, it might multiply it by 7.
it took a long time to kind of agree on everything. But in that paper, I think we kind of tried to say that, there's this currency hierarchy and we see it empirically. You can identify it, you can measure it, as opposed Keynesians do. But in order to kind of a more interesting question, maybe it's not just measuring it and kind of identifying it, but it's to kind of try to understand how it came to be. And I would argue that there is a currency hierarchy. It's a reflection of uneven development, basically, right? Where the stronger, more developed economies have a stronger currency and the less developed ones, less industrialized ones have weaker currencies. So in that sense, if you think of that as the causal mechanism, which leads to this issue, it becomes maybe more complicated to think about a solution for the problem. So it's not just that, maybe having a stronger currency would help you develop more or industrialize. But in order to have a stronger currency, you need to industrialize. So there's they hang together very, and I think it's important to have both of those in mind. It's not just a monetary problem. It's not just a problem of the currency of the currency. It's a problem of the uneven development, which has been historically produced. Which leads to these issues both in terms of production and finance, they're interlinked.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was just managing chat a little bit. Someone's being very annoying. As usual. Okay. So congratulations, everyone. Sorry. So yeah, that is a bit depressing. So because I guess for me, when I read about something like the CFA franc and the dollar dependence in Latin America, my first thought is, again, as I had with the IMF and the World Bank, my sort of filthy reformist liberal vibe is, well, let's just abolish that. Let's abolish the CFA franc. I think that's something that could feasibly be done, right? It's okay, let's let these countries have their own currency. With the dollar, it's a little bit more implicit, but I know there are moves. There have been for a long time moves in Latin America to establish their own reserve currency. But I guess, this is why I'm hearing a lot of Marxism, because for you and dependency theories, there's these things obviously don't help. And I'm sure you would agree that you would like to see them abolished, right? But that's just a reflection and a reinforcement of something deeper. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah. I think exactly. It's a reinforcement. So it's a reinforcement of something deeper. So it's not that, abolishing it somehow, if you could, abolishing the CFA would be great. Because then, these countries don't have to have this very kind of tight fiscal regime. But it wouldn't mean that they would then, be able to, they might be able to, invest a little bit more, have a little bit more expansive fiscal policy, but it wouldn't mean that they would industrialize and become South Korea or something like that, unfortunately. So that's why I think that, some of these regional agreements, I think they can be helpful and provide some alternatives for these countries that can give them a little bit more breathing space financially. But ideally, they should come with some kind of, not just look at the monetary side or the currency side, but also think about regional production networks, for example, some kind of trade agreements, maybe, so that it's considering more than just this reflection of underdevelopment or uneven development.
So, somebody in chat who isn't annoying asks, how would Ghana be industrializing if the West just didn't exist at all and disappeared along with its companies and capital? If you could do that overnight, what do you think the effects would be?
If the rest of the world disappeared?
Just the West, just the global North, yeah.
Yeah. So if they disappeared today, tomorrow Ghanaians would wake up and say, okay, there's the peasants that are growing cocoa. There's the workers in the mines. Problem, though, is a little bit that, what would happen to, for example, Anglo Gold Ashanti is a huge mining corporation. They own several mines in Ghana. All of the major mines are owned by a multinational corporation. So if we abolish the West, and they're all based in the West. Yeah. So they would be taken over by I guess, domestic capitalist class.
Yeah.
Which would be, could be interesting, because there is look, I'm studying Anglo Ashanti specifically, and there was a moment when like it was originally a colonial investment, British investment, and then there was a point of like Africanization in the corporation where like the CEO was Ghanaian, and the headquarters moved to Accra. It was still like very kind of exploitative and extractive, and created a lot of uneven development in that mining town. But in that period when it was like localization, as they called it, they were still like the CEO was still in London like very often and took advice from City of London. So there was this, just because it's owned by Ghanaians doesn't actually change the structure. So I'm thinking now, okay, so what if they weren't dependent on the City of London? City of London wasn't in the picture. What would happen then? Which is, interesting hypothetical experiment. I think the capitalists would still, do what they can to exploit workers as much as possible. But they would have to figure out different ways of accessing funds. Probably there would be some kind of regional agreements with, I guess, West Africa, or they would maybe try to develop some kind of regional trade between them. They need, I guess the interesting thing would be like, for example, the value chain where like the minerals used to go mostly to the West or China for processing, and then become some kind of manufactured good that's then imported back to Ghana. They would then face the challenge of figuring out how to manufacture these things themselves. So that, could be positive for industrialization, because if the West didn't exist, then there wouldn't be like, I guess, help in terms of technology transfers. I mean, that help isn't there anyway, but they wouldn't be able to even import expensive.
I mean, I was gonna ask, are there any sort of positives from having the West around, right? And obviously, it's a bit of a silly question, it's a tongue-in-cheek question, but it's like, clearly there's going to be teething difficulties if half the world disappears overnight. That's not something anybody wants. But is it the case that some of these dependent relationships, some of these exploitative relationships, are they counterbalanced at all by aid from the West, and aid in the general sense, not just in the narrow philanthropical sense, but like is there, are they just general benefits that run in the other direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that no country in the world has industrialized successfully without the support of the West. So that's something.
Yeah.
Looking at those, other countries in the global South, it's hard to say what's, benefits. What's the benefit? Like some would say that, well, the spread of global value chains and offering jobs in global value chains is some kind of benefit. And it's hard to kind of evaluate if it is or not. Aid, I mean, there are definitely positive things in terms of, providing some kind of, some resources for poverty management or poverty reduction. I'm quite critical of aid in the narrow sense. I guess that's also what you were hinting at when you said that you don't mean the narrow sense.
Yeah.
So I think, there's investment that leads to, introduction of consumer goods, big malls, some, cheap goods that become available to people. So it's hard for me to say. I mean, of course, there's like, I think people, depending on who you ask, they would maybe identify different things as benefits. I don't know. I'm having a hard time, like, analytically getting my head around, like, what's a benefit.
Maybe the question is just a bit too far-fetched, right? But I get, no, it's interesting because it's kind of like the international or development version of the Joan Robinson quote, right? Like the
Yeah,
only
I thought
choice
about
is
that.
between being
Yeah.
exploited. The only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited at all, right?
Yeah.
And it's like these kind of long-term growth strategies, bringing countries into global value chains, is that kind of the only way for them to grow, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
So let me ask you, because I want to go back to finance before we went on a detour through our imaginations. I want to ask you about the Wall Street consensus, right? I spoke to Daniela Gabor not too long ago, and when I was reading about international financial subordination, it seemed kind of similar, because this is just basically the idea that everything that is done, the Wall Street consensus is the idea that everything that's done kind of is done in the interests of Wall Street in some sense. And so that obviously places the financial sector of the USA, as well as, perhaps the city of London as well, and maybe Frankfurt or whatever, above the developing countries. So how do the two relate? Do you see them as connected?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely some connection there. I do think that we cite Daniela. I hope we do in the paper.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah. So Wall Street consensus, I think. I mean, I think Daniela Gabor kind of presents it as something that comes after post-Washington consensus, right? That it's like IMF, World Bank, and their allies in the global financial community have certain ideas of how development should happen, and that becomes very dominant across the world. And that helps to, what was the word that you used? Reinforce some of the inequalities that already exist. So, and the thing with the Wall Street consensus is that it does add things. I mean, so I don't know how much the people here know about, Washington consensus.
Please explain it. When in doubt, explain it,
Okay, yeah. So, because Washington consensus from the 80s, and then, and that, the thing with this paradigm of the IMF and the World Bank is that they had the Washington consensus, which was about, you need to, in order to develop, or in order to get any support from the IMF and the World Bank, you need to liberalize your trade, you need to deregulate your financial markets, and you need to privatize all state-owned industry. So, these countries in the global south, the low-income countries went through it in the 80s, and the slightly more richer ones went through it in the 90s. And this kind of consensus has evolved, not like moving away from those core tenets, but adding to it. So like post-Washington consensus was like, okay, so they realized that actually the structural adjustment programs, which were implemented with the Washington consensus, led to huge amounts of poverty and collapse in industry and unemployment. So they're like, okay, so it's not just deregulate and privatize and liberalize, it's also strengthen institutions. So you need to, and have some social policies to catch those that fall outside the system. So those two things were, added to the post-Washington consensus. And then those are kind of still there and kept in place. But then with the Wall Street consensus, what's added to it is the role of the financiers in Wall Street and City of London and globally, so that the developing countries then should open up to also provide assets for global financiers to invest in addition to the other things. So that is supposed to attract money to these countries. That's the idea. That's how it's sold to the world. But in the end, it's financial markets are developed in these countries in order to kind of liberalize, so that investors can come from the global north and buy local currency bond markets, bonds from Ghana, for example, in cities with high yields and make lots of money on that. So that it's part of Wall Street consensus. And what we've been seeing is that this has led to more financial markets, but not the money hasn't been going to structural transformation, industrialization, anything like that. Often it's bonds issued by it's government bonds, or it could be banks that are not necessarily investing in like something that's creating jobs or anything like that. Another part of so it's not like leading to a transformative change, basically. Another part of the Wall Street consensus is public-private partnership, which is allowing a lot of corporations to come in to provide services for the government, like waste collection or all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, I think that makes these countries more exposed to the global economy. It breaks down some barriers between all these countries and the global north and global south. But it doesn't lead to this convergence idea that, they would, the people that promote it would say that, oh, this will lead to development, this will lead, to catch up, this will lead to finance flowing in so that countries can rise up. But instead, it's led to kind of a continuation of this hierarchical structure. It's not dealing with the underlying issue, right? So I think that, depending on where you're coming from, in a way, the Wall Street consensus is a kind of empirical observation of what the IMF and the World Bank are pushing for and what they're doing. So you could understand it from a dependency theory perspective and see like, this is happening. It's a continuation of what happened before. It's reinforcing the same patterns. Or you could, I guess, understand it from a Wall Street perspective and be like, yeah, this is happening now. It's creating all these opportunities for us. It's great. Yeah.
Yeah. It's something. It's this idea of de-risking, isn't it? Which is, as far as I can see, is basically the public sector taking on the risk and the private sector getting the benefit. Yeah. Now, the idea is that encourages financing, as you said, right? But is very common, and Keir Starmer even committed to it in the Labour manifesto in the UK, right? So, yeah, it does seem to be these. Firstly, you're absorbing the state capacity of whichever country is using it, disproportionately poorer countries, but also, this investment, this financial investment. It's a bit like the sort of relying on commodities, isn't it? It's quite volatile, and it doesn't. It seems to potentially just lead to more instability. And the investors come in sometimes. Sure, maybe they do, and there might be some benefits, but they can rush out just as easily, and then you're left with financial crisis, which seems even more dangerous.
And you're not allowed to have capital controls to protect yourself from that.
No, you're not allowed capital controls. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm wondering what you think of the sort of IRA, onshoring, nearshoring, industrial policy, the Bidenomics, basically, let's call it. All these investments made mostly in the USA. There have been others around the world. The EU's kind of made motions towards investing in things. And there is this idea, right, of bringing manufacturing back home. So this goes in sort of counter to what's been happening for the past few decades. How does this fit within a sort of dependency theory lens, this whole thing? Is it outside of it? Is it unexpected? Is it an anomaly, or does it just sort of reproduce the same logic?
I think that's a very good question. So I think that Bidenomics, in a way, what Biden's doing, or onshoring, this kind of nationalism, is something that is not just Biden, right? It's actually, you can see it's a global trend across the globe that countries are becoming more nationalist. And, global south and global north. And I think that can be seen as a reflection of the uneven development within these countries, and basically failure of neoliberalism, right? Because this liberalization of production, which led to jobs moving abroad, deregulation, which was not, it was pushed on the global south in a very violent way, but it was also, neoliberalism is also established in the global north, has led to huge amounts of profits for some, but also huge amounts of inequality and poverty and unemployment. So, and this links a little bit to what you were saying about the Brazilianization, which I wouldn't use that term, but linking back to that. But now you see this unevenness that we know from the global south is also kind of becoming visible in the global north, which the people don't know how to fix within the system because can't fix it in the system. So then they're resorting to national policy, trying to do what they can. And then I think the difference between global north and global south in this story is that the countries in the global north have a lot more capacity to do things. The state can do a lot more, especially US, because they, are a superpower and they're an empire. So Biden is still, working within a kind of market neoliberal logic, but trying to somehow reconcile the contradictions by also promising jobs, which he can't really do without having some kind of nationalist plan to bring jobs back and whatever. I'm not sure actually, this is me being ignorant, but I'm not sure how successful it's been, this onshoring business. I guess unemployment is a bit lower now in the US, but I don't know if that's
I think it's been quite successful from what I know in terms of the growth of manufacturing in the USA and actually in Mexico as well. It's been quite high, but I don't know if this is, I suppose it seems like a situation where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't if you're a poor country, because if you're brought into the sort of global value chain system, it's in these very, very exploitative sort of Foxconn type conditions in regimented factories assembling iPhones. But then if those are taken away, if those manufacturing jobs are somehow absorbed back into the core, then you're possibly even worse off, given that it's the same system. So I guess it comes back to this is it just a question of do you have to just completely rethink the entire system to solve the problem?
Yeah, it would be interesting to study which jobs went back, what were the which jobs were where did they leave from, and what happened in the country where they left.
Yeah,
and what happened in where the jobs that were created in the US. I don't know if someone has studied this. Maybe it's too early. It
might be too soon, but it is interesting. Did they replace? Maybe they didn't replace jobs. I don't know. Maybe they didn't replace jobs in the global south, or at least they didn't actively eliminate jobs. They perhaps prevented jobs from being created in the future, if you know what I mean. Yeah. But it's definitely a really interesting question, that.
But I think it's I feel like it's a reflection of the intense poverty and inequality that has been, building up in the US for a while. That's unsustainable, really. It's led to this kind of, nationalist drive to put America first and create these external threats, right? It's China's fault.
Of course. But, that's really noticeable if you're outside the US. The banging drums for China. I don't think we really share it in the UK. I don't think we have the same relationship with China. I don't think they really notice us. But I think in America it's much more. It's just much more noticeable coming from American publications and stuff. So I wanted to ask you, and this is kind of what your paper / PhD was focused on. But dependency theory, it was kind of rejected for a bit, and then it's seen a bit of a revival recently. You define it quite broadly, right? You actually define it as a research program, so it has different iterations. It's a way of maybe structuring analysis, so you can't really say, is it kind of true or false type thing. That's not how to think about it. But what do you think are some major limitations of dependency theory as a whole? What are some of the more sensible critiques you've seen out there of everything we've discussed?
I think that so in that paper I kind of tried to when I identified the strength that the features that I mentioned earlier at the beginning, I considered them the strengths that were worth preserving, whereas there are
could you repeat them for our audience?
It was a historical analysis of global capitalism.
Yep.
The connectivity and development. The polarizing nature of capitalism, uneven development, how it's produced in like domestically and globally, locally, different levels, and constraints, like kind of theorizing from the South and seeing like specific constraints that are there, like for example, related to currency hierarchy, as we mentioned, or balance of payments.
What are the barriers facing these countries? Yes, yeah.
Yeah, like specificities. But then, there were some, I think, so some of the problems, like some of the weaker parts of dependency theory were quite descriptive. And I think this was one of the critiques, that like some of the literature wasn't really explaining underdevelopment. We're saying, oh, there's dependence, so there's underdevelopment, and there's underdevelopment because there's dependence.
Right.
So it's like tautological. So there's been quite a few critiques of this kind of tautological thinking. And other kind of, descriptive situations of dependence, kind of just descriptive. Which I think that I would hope, my impression is that is kind of a thing of the 70s, and that, that's not reproduced as much in the revival of the tradition.
Is that something you get away from by talking about these specific barriers, would you say? Is that
Yeah, I think, exactly. Yeah, because then you have specific constraints, mechanisms, and the historical, evolution of how things came to be. I think that helps. That helps a lot.
Yeah, history is, it's worth saying, sorry to interrupt, but, history, when you know about history, it is kind of... It's kind of circular reasoning in a sense that something that happened, and you reason from that, right? So if these countries have developed to be dependent, then if you have to establish that historically, right, to avoid the pure circularity. But there is something that you have to accept as historically true at some point, right? And you spoke about that at the beginning with the head start England got, colonization and everything like that, right? So that's a fact to be reckoned with, right? And that's a strength of dependency theory, that it does that instead of a comparative advantage grid or whatever.
No, I absolutely agree. And then I think also like getting beyond history, super important to establish kind of what happened, and then having an explicit theory. This seems obvious, I guess, for an academic, but some of the literature was a bit descriptive and didn't necessarily theorize capitalism, which is why I added this strength. You're theorizing capitalism as something uneven, which a lot of the literature did. But some of it was a bit more like, oh, you just need to, bargain with a multinational corporation and then you can have dependent capitalism. Or, there was a bit not very analytical. So this was the more conservative part of dependency theory. And then I think kind of related to what I mentioned before, that some of it was actually ended up reproducing some of the Eurocentric parts of development economics, and kind of by focusing on the nation state and kind of thinking that, if only all these barriers weren't there and all these constraints weren't there, then we could develop, which is a bit like the structuralists, basically. If only we could, and thinking about the nation as a unit that you could develop in that way. And that, so that's maybe, related a little bit to methodological nationalism that I mentioned. And also I think this unequal exchange literature, which is a strand of dependency theory, maybe reproduces that a little bit, that, there's all these units in the world and they're just exchanging unequally with each other. And therefore, that's why there's underdevelopment, instead of kind of thinking about how production evolves and the unevenness and kind of locating, this is very Marxist again, but locating capitalism and capital accumulation with production, not just unequal exchange. There might be unequal exchange too, but that could be a symptom or a reflection of uneven development in production. So I think those are some of the weaknesses, I would say. And it's interesting now that there seems to be a revival that's happened maybe in the past 10 years. I didn't know when I was doing my PhD. I graduated 6 years ago, so I guess maybe I started working on this 9 years ago. I felt then a bit alone. I didn't know that actually a lot of other people were just starting to work on the same thing, and really. But there must have been something, in the kind of inequalities that were becoming more prominent, visible. People kind of seeking new theoretical frameworks to try to understand global inequalities. And now there's loads of books and special issues and stuff coming out. I just got this new book by one of my co-authors, Felipe Antunes de Oliveira, which I haven't read yet, but Dependency Crisis, Brazil and Argentina, is revisiting dependency theory and looking specifically at Brazil and Argentina. So that's, looking forward to reading that.
That's cool. I mean, those were the countries that it was kind of developed in, right? Which we discussed at the start, right? It's like that kind of the frustrating failure of Latin American industrialization to take off, and the context of that. So it's interesting to see that updated. I wanted to ask you about. I kind of mentioned comparative advantage in passing, and I don't want to necessarily go into a deep critique of mainstream economics, but I suppose I'm just wondering, with some of the modern stuff on mainstream trade, you've seen, I think, a belated acknowledgement of the negative effects of something like free trade, right? And now a lot of the modern trade models and studies are much more complex, and they tend to emphasize manufacturing decline and things like that. The type of thing that was implicated in the election of Donald Trump, the first one, for example. But so what do you make of how, beyond the kind of basic comparative advantage straw man type thing, how what do you make of how the mainstream literature has developed on this kind of question? Are they showing any signs of getting it, or are they not?
I think that economists are constrained by their tools, unfortunately. But I think they're. I mean, if you think about the economics discipline, I don't think is really getting it, but economists are getting it. Like, they're not stupid. Like, they can see that it's not, like, free trade doesn't work, right? That it's creating inequalities, and the rise of Trump, all this stuff. But then what happens is, like, they have the comparative advantage model and then try to adjust it, add imperfections and stuff. And I guess this started already in the 70s with Krugman trying to come up with, like, new trade theory and stuff. So they've added, like, externalities and, like, various things that could lead you to then find negative effects in the model, which could then help to explain what you actually see. So that's kind of like a positive development, I guess, within the mainstream, that they see reality, doesn't fit, come back, try to fix the model and apply it again. Of course, I think the model is inherently faulty to begin with, so I don't think it's like the best. I think we can do much better than that by fixing comparative advantage. And also, one of the problems, I think, is that even with these added imperfections in the models, the general implication is still that free trade is generally good, which Roderick makes very clear in his in his new evaluation of trade. So that's a bit disappointing after all this, like, acrobatics of adding imperfections and stuff. But so that's kind of a problem. And then I think the other development that's happened, which is related, is the kind of industrial policy literature that I mentioned before, with Nathan Lane and people like that, who kind of they kind of make a case for industrial policy, but the way they make it is still very close to a free trade. It's like with some small policies here and there, rather than like huge structural transformation kind of argument from the developmentalists. So I think it's it's good that people are recognizing that basic comparative advantage from Ricardo doesn't work, but that's that's been recognized a long time ago. And then, like, they're starting to kind of find ways to kind of incorporate things that they think are important. But the problem then is that they kind of deflect or don't engage with the more radical literature, which has an alternative way of understanding structural transformation to begin with, because then they find that they can satisfactorily enough, I don't know if you can say that in English, explain what's happening within the models.
It's okay, I make up words all the time on this stream, so it doesn't matter.
Okay. Yeah. I have a PhD student who's just finished a very excellent chapter on comparative advantage, where he went through all the most current mainstream literature. So it's like all clear in my mind now that I'm like, because sometimes I'm like, have they actually, radically changed?
Yeah.
After reading this chapter, I was like, yeah, I can see now they haven't. I mean,
I guess it comes back to what I said near the beginning, right? Because it's like, although they have acknowledged that industrial policy can be good and free trade isn't always the answer, there's still firstly a presumption in favor of trade as the default, and markets in general, but also I think a lot of these case studies of industrial policy failing, like Latin America, weigh heavily on the empirical analysis, right? So they'll just say, well, yeah, industrial policy is possible to make it work, but don't go too far, because otherwise you'll be like Latin America, and that's because of that policy, rather than asking about this broader global context and this dependency in the way that the dependency theorists do.
Yeah. And it's like, when they do talk about industrial policy, it's like, yeah, you can have a little bit, but it should be in line with your comparative advantage to, it shouldn't go too far, because then you're taking a risk and governments can fail. And that's, So
I suppose to push on this point, because would you say that in mainstream economics, comparative advantage is often assumed to be kind of innate, right? So they're saying if you don't have a comparative advantage in something, then you shouldn't really push it, or it should be, maybe sectorally close to your comparative advantage, adjacent or something. Whereas dependency theories might emphasize that the reason you can't do that is because of the barriers you face, right? The reason you don't have a comparative advantage in whatever is due to these barriers. It's not something innate, it's not just like we grow bananas, we grow oranges, and then we trade, right? That is what determines the comparative advantage, at least at a first glance. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. They don't ask the question of why it's like that to begin with, and then once you ask that question, it also, a whole lot of other questions come up about the possibility of transforming or upgrading, or what you want to trade for. And
it's ahistorical, right, isn't it? I mean, I think fundamentally at its heart is ahistorical, and I think someone like Danny Roderick, who I do actually have quite a lot of respect for, to be fair, I don't know if you feel the same way, but he obviously, when you read his work, it's historical, right? But I think if you look at like the education of an economist, it goes first through the abstract models, and then you kind of bring in confirmatory case studies, whereas what we're talking about is kind of starting with the history.
Yeah. And I just think a fundamentally different theory or view of
course.
The world.
Yeah. What's your experience, trying to teach this to students, many of whom may have started with mainstream economics or comparative advantage or whatever? Are they resistant? Do they understand it? Do they love it?
Good question. I think undergrads tend to really feel challenged and inspired by dependency theory and that kind of critique of comparative advantage. Which is great. So that's like really fun to teach. And then postgrad level, I think it depends. Some will be like, wow, this is super interesting, like want to write their master's thesis about it and stuff like that. Whereas others, I think maybe it's when you reach people at postgrad level, it's a little bit too late to try to start changing their minds.
For sure.
And they're like, that's one way of seeing things, but but I mean, generally, my experience has generally been very positive, but I've just noticed that, like, I think it's a bit harder to introduce new material and get people really on board at postgrad level if they don't already have some kind of inclination towards that kind of way of thinking, like a structural way of thinking. I feel like sometimes there's something about the econ degree that, even though it's theory heavy, it doesn't actually teach you to theorize. It's more like you learn the theory as a fact.
It's learning by rote, isn't it?
Yeah, and dependency theory is very theory heavy, and you have to like think about assumptions and all this stuff. So it's a whole different way of thinking, um, which which is hard to teach later, like after someone's already been through a kind of rigorous economics BA. I think it's hard to teach that way of thinking. It's not just necessarily the theory, just the theory or just like the insight from dependency theory, but a whole different way of like, yeah, thinking about the world.
What's your experience with like, economists, sort of full-blown mainstream economists? I mean, do you get any engagement from them or?
Yeah, we actually presented, me and Devika, one of my co-authors on the book, we presented a part of our module on decolonizing economics to the economics department in my university. And we presented it almost right after our deadline for the book. So admittedly, we hadn't thought very carefully about the audience. So we just presented it as we presented it to the students, kind of, this is Eurocentrism, these are different ways of thinking about capitalism, and this is the mainstream, these are the problems. And it felt like some of the people didn't understand at all and thought we were strawmanning and that it was completely wrong, and we didn't recognize the mainstream at all. Whereas others, it could have a bit more of a conversation, but we were like, oh no, like we should have started, I think, in a different register and explained a little bit more. And I think this is an issue that I also face with some of these postgrad students, that if you're a trained economist and you're doing some kind of work, you've never actually maybe been introduced to the fact that economics discipline is, founded on methodological individualism, and what that is and what that means. Because, that's kind of a philosophical thing that we as heterodox economists who critique the mainstream talk about and, discuss, but it's not something that they would necessarily agree with or even think is true. So, so there were like things like that we were like, oh, wow, that was tough. Like the questions were, they were tough, but not really in a rigorous, oh, now we're having a rigorous, interesting debate kind of way. It was more like, oh no, we're just talking past each other now. This is not really working. Okay. So that was the most recent interaction.
At least you were invited.
Yeah. No, that was good. That was good. Yeah.
Frustrating. It's hard. I mean, it's difficult, right? Like it with any heterodox economics as well. I find there's a lot of resistance and mutual misunderstandings, perhaps. And it's just if you only think that you can do economics one way, then. Then when someone else comes along with something new, you're basically like, well, this can't be economics because what I do is economics and that's it. Yeah, exactly.
But I think I have communicated more successfully in other scenarios. I mean, we were discussing it, because I think in some senses, no matter how careful you are in the way you build the argument and communicate it, some people will always dismiss you.
Of course.
That's just, so we can't put it only on ourselves. But I do think there are some people you can get if you just target it a little bit differently. And so I mean, try to be
one of your papers is a little bit about this, isn't it? Both students and economists. And I think it falls along sort of a few lines. Women are more likely to be sympathetic to these kinds of statements. Global South scholars are more likely, and junior faculty are more likely as well, right? So you can kind of position it to those people and kind of reach those people and
that's true. There was also I guess we could also, I mean, some of the results from that survey that we did also showed that there are certain critiques that they're more open to than others, like interdisciplinarity, things that don't challenge the core are a bit more easy to take. But of course, I mean, our book is not really easy to take, I think, for mainstream economists, but we could build up, the things that they would agree on, and then, boom, capitalism.
Okay, so I just opened something wrong. We both have to go, but it's been a really interesting chat, and there are other things I could have asked you about, but I think we'll save it because you do have this book coming out on decolonization. Which, when is that actually coming out, by the way?
We're not sure yet. Hopefully this fall.
Okay.
But we unfortunately had a little bit of word cutting issue. So the words are currently being cut by the proposed cuts are being made now by the editors. And then, hopefully.
Okay.
November, December.
November, December. Yeah. November, December. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'd like to talk to you and your co-authors about that as well. You've also got papers on RCTs, which I could talk about for a long time. And you've also got one on GDP. But I mean, you've written so much, but we've only really touched on some of it here. But anyway, so thanks so much for coming to speak to me, Ingrid. It was really, really interesting. I hope to speak to you again sometime.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. It's been super, super fun. Yeah.